I'm not much of a red wine drinker, but I feel like this video calls for it. Hey y'all, my name is Kayla, and welcome to my cozy chaotic corner of the internet. In today's video, I am coming very late to a topic, and that is about the author of Colleen Hoover. Did that make sense? Now, I have the disclaimer. The reason I am late to this particular conversation is because pretty much for the past decade, I haven't been reading anything, let alone, the hot authors. Now, I wouldn't say Colleen Hoover at this point in time is an hot author, but I know for damn sure back in 2020, everyone and their mother was saying you need to read Verity. Maybe that was 2021. Never read Verity, but I know everyone and their mother was up in arms about that. To be so totally for real with you guys, I actually started this whole project back in June of last year, where I was going through, okay, what books do I want to read? Why do I want to read certain books? How am I going to kind of give myself the best variety of Hoover's works without reading every single book? There was a lot that went into it, and a lot that went into it before I ever even knew about the movie It Ends With Us. We're going to talk about that movie in next week's video because I'm actually going to watch it for the very first time, and I do want to note I'm not going to be talking about all of the drama that's going on with Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni and everything like that. I just want to talk about the movie itself and how it connects or doesn't connect to the book, but I feel like I've been babbling on about a whole bunch of nothing. So let's just get to the point. I decided that the categories of books that I wanted to try out was the highest rated book, the lowest rated book, her debut novel, most rated, least rated, shortest without being a novella. And I thought like that would give me a broad enough scope of what her works are without having to delve into every single book. With all of that noted, let's just jump right into the deep end. And we're actually going to start with her highest rated book and the book I've actually read most recently, and that is Reminders of Him. After serving a prison sentence, Kenna returns to the town where everything went wrong, hoping to reconnect with her daughter, but the people in her past are unwilling to forgive. The only person who might help is Ledger, her daughter's guardian, though his reluctance and their growing connection complicate everything. And I feel like that little summary does the book well enough. Like, you get the general scope of things, but the whole tragedy of this book is that Kenna was in a relationship with, oh my god, I'm blanking on his name. We'll just call him Steve. But Kenna was in a relationship with this man called Steve, and Steve was Ledger's best friend. Steve had amazing parents. He had a very normal childhood. And Kenna was kind of like the total opposite, where Steve kind of had that white picket fence, American dream upbringing. Kenna had a mother who wasn't very involved in her life, was a little flighty, and because of that, Kenna actually went into the foster system. Kenna and Steve have this amazing romantic relationship. It was beautiful. They loved each other, even though they were kind of sort of polar opposites. However, Kenna didn't really meet a lot of Steve's family. Like, she met the mom and dad one time. It was apparently a bad experience. Didn't really get off on the best foot. She never met Steve's best friend, Ledger. Ultimately, the reason that Kenna went to prison was because one night, Steve and her went to a party, had a little one too many drinks. Kenna's driving home, and they get into a car accident because they're driving down a dirt road, speeding a little bit too much. I think they either took a bad turn or hit the brakes, and all of a sudden they got into a wreck. And Steve, unfortunately, passes in this wreck, but in her slightly intoxicated hysteria, she flees the scene and goes to her house, and that's where she's found and, gets convicted of manslaughter. But the thing is, Shortly after she gets sentenced to prison, she finds out she's pregnant. There's a bun in the oven. Steve's parents end up becoming the guardians of Kenna's daughter. So when Kenna gets out of prison, she goes back to this town where she knows her daughter is living with her grandparents. Ultimately, the whole drama of what ends up happening on her very first night back in town, she goes to this place that used to apparently be a bookshop that her and Steve used to go to all the time. It's now a bar. She meets a man who's the bartender. He's actually the owner of the bar, but at the time she thinks it's a bartender. They have a conversation. They may smooch a little. It's very heavy on the flirtation. And she finds out this is Ledger, Steve's best friend. But she doesn't reveal like who she actually is. And all this drama ensues pretty much where she's trying to get back into her daughter's life. The grandparents don't really want her in the daughter's life. They're like, everything's perfect. They obviously hold a huge grudge against her. And Ledger is like conflicted because he's been such a part of this little girl's life growing up. Doesn't quite know how to feel about Kenna because he's like, she seems like a nice person, but like she's the reason my best friend is dead. So lots of conflict there. Eventually what ends up happening is there's a happy ever after. Now, I actually really enjoyed this book. Was it a little ridiculous? Did I want to scream and yell? Were there parts where I was like, oh my god, you're being such a douche canoe, to multiple characters actually throughout this book. There were times where I was like, can you just sit down and have a conversation with Kenna about the grandparents? Because they never really did that. They never really gave her the time of day to even like vindicate herself. I know, yes, of course, like she's the reason your son is dead, but like she's also the mother of your grandchild. I don't know. I was very frustrated with that. I was frustrated with Ledger for a little bit. There was one character in this book though, Roman. He is like the wise sage that is just like saying the things that everyone's thinking but no one's saying out loud. He's like, dude, give Kenna a chance because you have to realize that is her daughter. That is her daughter. You don't know what happened that night. Just as much as you feel like her daughter deserves to stay with her grandparents, Kenna deserves a chance to at least meet her daughter. Get to know her to some capacity. So I loved Roman. Roman was like my man this entire book. But yeah, reminders of him. I feel like it's an interesting dynamic because while it's not like my favorite book on the entire planet, I enjoyed it. However, the rest of these books on this list, I feel a little different about. Okay? We feel a little different about. So we are gonna hop on to Maybe Not, which was actually the lowest rated book out of Colleen's entire catalog. And this book is actually a novella. She has a few series where she also has like little novellas that can slide into the middle of series, and that's what Maybe Not is. And Maybe Not is about Warren, who agrees to let the icy and mysterious Bridget move in as his roommate. He expects tension, but not an irresistible attraction. As their pranks and fights escalate, Warren is determined to break through her walls, even if it means risking heartbreak. Now, this was actually the first book I read, and I know what you may be thinking. It's like, Kayla, this is like a weird middle novella. Why are you reading this? To be so totally for real with you, it was because it was the lowest rated book, all of them. And I kept going back and forth on if I wanted to include novellas and short stories in this lineup, but I figured, you know what? Why not? Let's do it. With Maybe Not in particular, because there's another half book in this lineup, but with Maybe Not, it felt like an easy standalone. Obviously, you'd have additional context on the entire cast if you read like the book before it, but it as itself, you could read it and completely understand it. And this is literally just a story of Warren, as we know, meets Bridget, and they get into this weird situationship. And this book in particular, I recall having a visceral reaction to the stupidity of it all. I'm not gonna lie, because this was the first book I read and I read it last summer, I don't recall the entire scope of it. I just remember being like, this is so dumb. if this is what the rest of these books are going to be like, I don't know how my brain's going to be able to cope with the stupidity of it all, because we actually have this entire book from the perspective of Warren, and he is like your stereotypical frat dude who's just thinking about boobs and sex, and literally this entire book is about boobs and sex. So, needless to say, if you want a sex scene or two, you can easily read this book. There's no depth to this book. I might feel differently if I had obviously read like the actual books that surround this little novella. If this was even just like a sampling of what the books around it are, thank you. Next, we have Slammed, which is Hoover's debut novel, and it's actually a young adult book. And to be so totally for real with y'all, this, I believe, was the second book I read. And I enjoyed it for being a young adult book. Like, if teenage Kayla had read this, 110%, I would have gobbled this up, absolutely been obsessed with it. Adult Kayla, a little bit of a different story, but I did appreciate it for it being a young adult book. And after reading the list of books that I've read, I felt like Hoover should have stayed in the young adult hemisphere, because something I've noticed, especially after reading It Ends With Us, and we will get to It Ends With Us, Hoover enjoys throwing everything and the kitchen sink into a story. So, what is Slammed about, you may ask? After losing her father, Lakin struggles to stay strong for her family, but everything changes when she falls for her charming neighbor, Will. Their intense connection is shattered when they discover he is actually her high school teacher, forcing them to navigate forbidden love, poetry, and heartbreaking choices. Yep. How is Lakin falling for her high school teacher? Well, Lakin and her family moved from Texas to Michigan after her father recently passed. Literally the day they moved to Michigan, they meet their neighbors, Will and his younger brother. Now, Will, I believe, is 20 years old, and Lakin, I believe in the book, is 17, about to turn 18. And she just is like, oh my god, look at this really cute neighbor of mine. Well, they have a little flirtationship. They get to know each other, get to like each other. Do I think a 17-year-old and a 20-year-old should be hanging out? No, but who really sits down and like asks names right off the rip? Nobody. Will assumed that Lakin was in college. Lakin assumed, I don't know what she assumed about Will, to be so totally fair with you, but he assumed that she was in college just because of like their conversations and the way they spoke and the way they interacted. He was like, oh, this is definitely not a high schooler. Surprise, please, surprise. But one thing we discover about Will is he is actually the guardian for his younger brother, because their parents had died, I believe, in a car accident, either a year or two prior. No, it was when Will was still in high school. So 2 to 3 years prior, their parents had passed away in a car accident, and Will was thrust into being an adult. The part that always confused me was, I'm like, okay, how is this 20-year-old like a teacher? Like, he's a full-blown teacher. He's not a teacher's aide. He's not a substitute teacher. He's like a teacher. So I'm like, how is a 20-year-old a teacher? So the reason that I have decided that Hoover throws everything in the kitchen sink is not only do we have an adult dating a teenager, we also have a parent who recently passed, we have a tragic car accident killing parents, and one of the biggest pivotal points in this story is we actually find out that Lakin's mother is dealing with cancer herself. Again, I think for a young adult book, while it dealt with like so many different things, it was a really enjoyable book. It had a very heartbreaking and sweet ending. I'm not going to tell you the end, but it was just so... I was sobbing, okay? I was sobbing because my favorite character in this book was the mother. I feel like Lakin kind of treated her mom like trash. She kept trying to like be this adult but was acting like a straight up child for 90% of the book. When Will found out that Lakin was one of his students, he was very adamant on like not having a relationship with her. But Lakin, like she, like the entire book, I just really didn't like Lakin at all. I feel like all the other characters I really appreciated and enjoyed, but our main character would just throw temper tantrums all the time. Oftentimes I'll find that I'm not enjoying certain characters. That's who I didn't enjoy in Slammed. Lakin herself was the character I was like, I cannot stand you. You are so annoying. Ugh. Lily Bloom thinks she's found the perfect love with the charming and ambitious Ryle Kincaid, but his darker side slowly emerges. As she struggles to break the cycle of abuse, her first love, Atlas, reappears, forcing her to make the hardest decision of her life. If you don't know what book this synopsis belongs to, good for you! I'm so proud of you. Cheers. If you do know what synopsis that book belongs to, we're delving into It Ends With Us. Now, It Ends With Us, I think there's this clip that perfectly puts into a visual representation of how I feel about Colleen Hoover's writings. So I'm gonna let Blake Lively take it away.
There is every color of human emotion in it. There's levity, there's joy, there's humor, there's hope, there's pain, there's tragedy, there's violence, there's trauma, there's sadness, there's exultation, there's life, there's death, there is like love, there's loss, there's just, I mean, really like, it is a kaleidoscope of the human experience.
Did you see how chaotic that clip was? Did you get like how like literally everything in the kitchen sink? I saw this clip during the craziness, the hubbubaloo of the press tour for It Ends With Us. And I was like, this is the epitome of Hoover's writing, is this clip in a nutshell. It's perfect. This clip explains it all. It's everything in the goddamn kitchen sink and a cherry on top. So It Ends With Us starts off with Lily Bloom at the top of a building, and she's just kind of like thinking of her life. Her father recently passed away. Her father was a dick and a half. He was abusive to her mom, heavily abusive to the mother, both emotionally, verbally, physically, sexually. Any abuse you could potentially think of, he did. And so the structure of this book is we get flashbacks and current time. So current time, Lily is dealing with her life and, dealing with the loss of her father, dealing with her mother who is grieving the loss of her father, but also dealing with the grief of losing someone who was abusive. And I think that is such an interesting perspective to have, because it's difficult in like the best of times and it's complicated in the worst of times. I feel like this story could have been so good and been taken seriously if another author had written it. Like if we took the structure of It Ends With Us and had someone else write it, I think this could have been a beautiful book. But there was this jarring... I feel as though It Ends With Us was a satire of abuse. I feel like this is a hard conversation to talk about. I say this as someone who has seen and experienced familial abuse. I think when it came to the father-mother dynamic, I think that was portrayed so well. And you really understood the gravitas of the situation. However, when it comes to Lily and Riles' relationship, it felt like a caricature in times because of the duality of these diary entries. Lily, when she was a young teenager, would write diary entries, and her diary entries were written to Ellen DeGeneres. And there was this weird duality between the severity of a situation and then Lily writing these diary entries to Ellen DeGeneres and saying, just keep swimming. So in your head, you have this visual of Dory the fish from Finding Nemo happily singing, just keep swimming. It felt like a satire. I don't think I need to tell anyone, but I don't think that abuse in any format should be made satirical. I don't know. Maybe I'm alone in that opinion, but I don't think it should be made satirical. Y'all, I'm not gonna lie. I rehearsed what I was gonna say about this book in my bathroom multiple times this week. And I feel like I'm not getting my point across. And I feel like I could sit here trying to hum and ha about what I actually want to say about this book. This book felt like the marketing for this book and movie. It felt like the cute nails. It felt like the bring your friends, grab your florals. That's what this book felt like. And I don't think it should have felt that way. But you guys let me know what you think. If you've read It Ends With Us, I would genuinely like to know your thoughts and opinions about this book. But let's move on to Finding Perfect, which is another one of those weird little novellas that slot into a series. Finding Perfect is about Daniel and Six. They have had a love that feels effortless, but a secret from the past threatens their future. As Daniel searches for closure and understanding, he realizes that true love requires honesty, trust, and a little bit of fate. They hooked up but didn't know each other. But through that hookup, she got pregnant, had a baby, put it up for adoption. And then a year or two down the road, they actually meet each other and fall in love. And through some sort of storyline, we don't know, maybe it happened in the actual series, but they discover that they were the people that they hooked up with back in I think it was a European trip. But they were in high school when they initially met, not realizing they met. And this book, similar to Maybe Not, Daniel was such a douche. He was so full of himself. He would always call this friend of his something that the friend didn't appreciate. And the friend would always tell him, don't call me that, don't call me that, don't call me that, don't call me that. And finally he snapped at him one day. And Daniel was like, oh, I didn't realize it meant that much. It's he's literally been telling you over and over and over again. He doesn't want you to call him that, but whatever. But anyways, once they realize that, oh my God, I had your baby, they want to try and find the baby, even though it was a closed adoption. And so they go through this whole process of finding the baby. And apparently it only took them a weekend. How realistic is that? It took them a weekend to find the parents who'd adopted the baby, and they get to meet the baby. Now, I didn't really have any emotional connection to Six. Again, Daniel was kind of just annoying. The family dynamic was interesting because Daniel this entire time hadn't told his parents about discovering that he's a father. It was just a very strange story. But I do remember at the end, when we meet the adopted parents, the mother was so lovely. She wrote this beautiful note to Daniel and Six, and I was sobbing reading this note. I didn't mention it earlier, but Slammed also had a letter from the mom who was dying of cancer. She wrote this gorgeous letter, and in both of these letters, I was just sobbing my little heart out. I'm like, okay, Colleen Hoover clearly just needs to write letters from mothers because I'm like sobbing. Like, that's all she needs to write, just a compilation of letters from mothers, because they were beautiful and amazing. And that's another thing I didn't mention earlier, but in reminders of him, Kenna would always write letters to Steve. I keep calling him Steve. I literally still don't recall what his name actually was. But she's writing these gorgeous letters to Steve, and they just feel genuine. And I'm just like, okay, how is she writing these gorgeous letters? And then, like, the rest of the book is meh, you know? So, Finding Perfect. Oh, I forgot to note, Finding Perfect was the least rated. So, it didn't have the lowest rating, it just had the least amount of ratings. And also, It Ends With Us was the most rated book. So, not the highest rated, just had the most ratings. Our last book, Layla, Colleen Hoover's shortest book without being a novella. After a traumatic attack, Leeds brings his girlfriend Layla to a remote bed and breakfast to heal, but she starts acting strangely, as if she's no longer the same person. When he meets another guest, Willow, who seems to understand him better than Layla does, he is torn between love, reality, and the supernatural. Let me tell you, the synopsis of this book is so misleading, but what we don't know, and what I'm about to tell you, so spoiler alert if you haven't read this book and you want to read this book, just la 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 la. Willow's a ghost. Willow's a ghost. So, and let me just say, I hated Leeds. I hated Leeds for a good 40% of the book. The entire time I'm like, what the fuck are you doing? What are you doing? What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? Couldn't stand him. Until the plot twist. I have never, y'all, with this book, I have never been like, what? No. This was by far my favorite Hoover book. Out of all the books that I read for this video, I loved Layla. I loved Layla, and I think I loved it so much because I was so angry and upset with Leeds for so much of this book. And then we get the plot twist, and I'm just like, this is, as soon as the plot twist happened, I was like, this is amazing. This is amazing. I love this book. I love this book. I love this book. It was so fun. The characters were so interesting. The storyline was unlike anything I've ever read before. The writing in this one, I wasn't rolling my eyes at. I didn't note this earlier, but the reason I felt like Hoover should have stayed in the young adult arena was because maybe not Slammed, It Ends With Us, and Finding Perfect all had the same writing style and cadence. It felt juvenile in a sense, whereas Reminders of Him kind of hovered in that hemisphere, but I think it did a much better job. And Layla, I'm like, do we have a ghostwriter here? I don't think she wrote this book because it was so good. I had such a good time with this book, and the fact that I just hated Leeds so much, and then at the end of the book I was obsessed with him. I was like, oh my god, I love him so much. I love them so much. I love it so much. Like, what? I loved Layla. It's like one of my top reads so far this year. It was amazing. I loved it. That's all I can say. I have nothing else to say about Layla. Just like read it. Out of all the books that Hoover has written, you have to read Layla. And you know the benefit of why it appeared on this list is it's her shortest book that's not a novella. So it's a quick read. So you should read it. And you should come back to me and let me know what you thought about Layla. Because a part of me is sitting here like, do I like this book so much because it's like completely different than any of Hoover's books? Or do I like this book so much because it's just a good book? So please, did you like this book? I need to know. But I feel like I've kind of covered all of my top talking points about Hoover's works. And I think the biggest takeaway is her works will make you feel something, good or bad. She should stick to writing letters from mothers. Has a semi-juvenile writing style, aside from Layla, don't know where that came up from, and Reminders of Him, which still had somewhat of that flair to it, but it was so much better than all the other ones. And she just likes to throw everything in the kitchen sink into her stories. Any sort of potential dramatic flair you could ask for is in her books that I've read. Anyways, y'all, it's so easy to just hop on a train and be like, oh, I can't stand Hoover's works, or oh my god, she's the best writer on the face of the planet. I think it's so easy to hop in this bandwagon, but realizing that I enjoyed Reminders of Him and I'm obsessed with Layla makes me realize that, not every piece of her work is going to be trash. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I will see you next week where we tackle It Ends With Us, the movie. Goodbye.